All right. Well, hello, Farrah. Thank you for joining us today. Just to jump right into it, if you could tell us a little bit about your background, what you do, what's like a normal Tuesday kind of like look like for you.
I'm an investigator with the Historical Homicide section here with the RCMP. My office is based in Edmonton. I've been a homicide investigator since 2016, so I'm coming on 10 years. I started investigating homicides in Saskatchewan. I was posted with one of the major crimes teams based out of Regina. And then in the summer of 2019, my family relocated here to Alberta and we live in the Edmonton area. And I am a sergeant now with the Historical Homicide Unit. So a regular Tuesday for me is a lot of mundane sitting at a desk staring at a computer screen because I work with historical homicide cases. So a lot of that is looking at reviews, looking through documentation to see areas that we can redo or do again, look at, focus on, so that we can bring that investigation to a close.
Was there anybody like in your family history that was also a part of RCMP, or is this just you?
No,
You're the first.
I'm the first copper of the family. I don't know why I chose this profession. I think through high school, I was always kind of, I wouldn't say a tomboy by any sense of the means, but I definitely always felt that law enforcement would be an area, and I really hoped to move into forensics. So when I first got into the RCMP, I always thought, okay, I'm going to be that, forensic officer that goes to crime scenes. And the more that I worked with those officers, I'm like, okay, I would much rather get into the more serious investigations. So when I was posted in Saskatchewan, that's when I started to move into the more complex investigations. So like I said, I wasn't always a homicide detective or investigator. I've only been in that for 10 years, but I've been a police officer for 24. So prior to that, I was in uniform frontline policing for 8 years. And then I went into different investigative sections. I did fraud for a while, but then I did move into homicide, like I said, in 2016. And that's when I had my first, I guess, homicide investigations and first dealing with, families and victims of homicide.
How did you first hear about victims of homicide here in Edmonton?
I was lucky to come into the historical homicide unit, and there were already pre-established police officers that already attended the meetings. There was, I think, 4 or 5 different investigators that I had talked to before I had gone, and they had talked about, the benefits of being there. And I guess one of my old staff sergeants, he had asked me to attend a meeting when he couldn't. He wasn't able to attend it. I said, yeah, for sure, I would go just to see how I could be of help. And that's when my first exposure, and that was probably close to 3.5, maybe 4 years ago. He has since retired from the RCMP, and I just kind of slid into that position. And I'm not sure if there's been many other RCMP officers besides the 3 or 4, that went before me. But I think since I've been going, there's a few from my office that will, sit in on days that I can't make it. But mostly I try to make each monthly meeting.
What do you believe are the benefits of an RCMP officer coming to the meetings?
I believe that there's times where there's questions that people will have, and that I can help explain why things were done certain ways, or when even mistakes happen, explain how those mistakes can be overcome, or even court questions, how it looks when it does go to court, because I know prosecutors don't attend the meeting, so sometimes I will answer those questions from my experience, or I can at least put that person in touch with somebody who can answer that properly. The benefits, I feel, sometimes are more for me than for the victims of homicide, because I see how survivors, how it really impacts their life, and how certain things, when you say things, it comes across terribly. So I think it's something for me that I can take back to my coworkers and explain, like, these are things that will set families through the roof, or these are things that really impact them, or these are things that we really need to change, things like that. So for me, I feel I benefit a lot so that I can make changes, or at least explain to the coworkers that are, working with families on a regular basis. So I do think it's a very mutual relationship.
If you don't mind walking us through what actually happens during a homicide investigation, from those critical hours all the way through the long haul, or until the investigation starts to show up in the courtroom, because I remember that's how we talked about. What should families realistically expect?
So, as you can imagine, the initial call comes in. The frontline police officers in whatever area of the province, get called to that incident. So uniform members will show up there and they'll assess what's happening. And then when they have determined it's a homicide, that's when they call in specialized homicide investigators from Calgary, Edmonton. So that's when I think those critical hours, those first initial stages, is when it's chaotic. There's so many things happening. There's so many things that those people on scene are trying to process. And if you are a family member that is there when this has happened, you will be in the midst of that chaos. So you will see that there are a lot of high emotions, stressful things, decisions made quickly, because everybody wants to make sure that the police are making the public safe. So a person has already lost their life. So the primary thing is making sure that everyone in the area is safe, because there is a perpetrator out there who has done that to somebody. So again, there's going to be chaos because there's high emotions, because there's somebody there that has just taken someone else's life. So if you are a family member that is on scene, you'll be right in the middle of that chaos. And you may be asked to leave the scene. You may be asked to leave your loved one's side. So there's a lot of things that, because that there's a situation of safety, that, you may not feel like you're being heard right in the initial stages. But from a police officer's perspective, all they want to do is make sure that that person is safe. So then as it progresses and as time goes on, there's a lot of things that happen in those initial first hours. That's when all of the different police resources are called in to help. So you have homicide investigators, you have interviewers, you have forensic specialists, you have people that'll be transporting your loved one to the office of the chief medical examiners. So there's a whole lot of people and a whole lot of things that are going on. And because that scene has to be so protected, families may be asked to give their name, their date of birth, and their phone number, and asked to go home and be somewhere safe, and that they'll be contacted later once they've been explained that their loved one has been died by homicide, and that there's an investigation started. At that point, I think the best advice to give to a family member is just to try and stay as calm, which is terrible because this is probably the worst day of your life. But ask questions. If something is happening and you don't understand why it's happening, just ask what's going on, and then you'll be explained on where to go and what to do and when you'll be contacted next. Because if your loved one has been murdered, you likely will be interviewed by a police officer, just to either get a background of your loved one, or if you were at the scene, you're a witness to it. There'll be a lot of things that the police will need information from you. But again, they want to make sure that you're in a headspace where you can give that information. So if you're right at the scene of the crime, it's going to be difficult. Mm-hmm. They may need information right then and there. They may need to know where the person went. They may need to know who your loved one is. So there's a lot of things that you'll be asked right at the get-go. Now, on the flip side, if you aren't where your loved one was, you may have a police officer come to your door and explain to you that your loved one was murdered. And then again, that's, something that's the worst day of a person's life. and to sit and hear that information. It may take a long time for that to sit and process and actually feel real. But again, that might be a time where the police need to get some information from you because they need to advance this investigation. So they may be asking questions of you that you're wondering why that is at the time. But there's a method and a madness to why you're being asked these questions at that time. And then later on, you may be asked to be interviewed even 2-3 days down the road if they need more information. But if you're not a witness to the crime, they would just most likely notify that your loved one has been taken by homicide.
So from what I understand, the priority from the officer's kind of standpoint is just safety first. Whether a family or friend was at the scene or not, the first priority for everyone involved is making sure people are safe, making sure they're in a somewhat good state to be able to handle information or give over information as soon as possible. And that's basically how everything starts to roll.
Yeah, there's a process where it'll be make sure the scene is safe and then make sure the scene is secure. Mm-hmm. So if you're wondering why there's 15 police officers running into a house, that might be because the person is still there.
Or even as why you're being asked to move away from the situation is so that
so that you're not a victim yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, so I hope that people don't think that as police officers as being pushy or rude, but right then at that moment, their primary purpose is to make sure that everybody there is safe. And then after that, you may be asked to leave for another reason. Like if the person that committed the murder has left, they may ask you to leave because then they need to keep the scene secure. Mm-hmm. So every piece of furniture in any position, the way people are, the way things are, all of that could tell a story. So they don't want people to be inside the scene of a crime. So if you live there and this is someone in your family who has been murdered, it's really difficult to ask them to leave their home, but it is the scene of a crime. Mm-hmm. So you try to make as best plans possible mm-hmm. to have them leave, go somewhere comfortable, go somewhere safe, go somewhere where they can process what's happening mm-hmm. while their home is a crime scene and it could be a crime scene for a day, a week. Like there's sometimes, a crime scene could be secured for an entire month while they're trying to, process evidence. Mm-hmm. So those are things that, you would constantly as a family member be getting an update as to what's happening at your home and also what's happening with your loved one. So that's something too, to be prepared that if something happens, you may not have access to that crime scene mm-hmm. because they need to process it and gather all the evidence they can. And they will not let you in that crime scene until it's been released by the lead investigator. The lead investigator will have the final say to say, okay, we've gathered everything. They may do like a final walkthrough of the house to make sure that everything has been videoed, photographed, swap. You may see, a lot of police things left at the house to show that, okay, yeah, this was a crime scene.
So during that in-between time of, you're being asked whether you're being asked to be in a place of safety, I'll just call it that kind of window. How do families feel connected? How do they connect and stay informed without getting in the way of the investigation?
So a lot of times when they're first contacted, whoever is their first police contact, be it someone at the scene or be it like a uniformed police officer that, responded to the call, or if it's somebody who came to notify them at their home, they will already be given a phone number and they'll be told this is the person who will be contacting you. So that phone number, they'll be given either a business card or, ask you to write this down, or they'll call you or text you so that you have a way to get in touch with them. So in those, critical hours, if there's burning questions, if there's things you definitely have to explain to the police, then that is the person that you reach out to. You just text them and say, please call me as soon as possible. A lot of times the person who interviews the family members are also tasked to interview other people. So if you're calling and you're not getting an immediate response by that person, it could be because they're in the middle of an interview with somebody else. So it's always my recommendation to leave a message or text that person and say, please call me back. I have information that I need to share, or please call me back. I'd like an update as to, when this is happening, or you guys have my home. I need my medication. There's a lot of things that, that is a burning need for the family at that time. So that is always something that the investigative team will work with the family to go get into the house, to get whatever they need, to take that statement from you, to learn that information, or just to give you regular updates on what to expect is going to happen next. That family liaison, that person that first meets the family, sometimes if they're the ones that notify you of the death, or the one that helps you get to a safe hotel room or something like that, they may not be the actual assigned family liaison to the investigative team. So each team will have an assigned investigator that works with that team. So they will know the updates. They will know what's happening because they sit in on the briefings. They hear what's happening. And they're the ones that will be assigned by the primary investigator to say, okay, I want you to let the family know this. So a lot of times that family liaison, they're not the person who's writing the warrants on the file. They're not the person who is the primary investigator, or the person that's in charge of the documentation, like the file coordinator, like the decision team. They're somebody whose sole purpose is really to work with the family and give them the updates. We don't normally have our primary investigator be the family liaison, because that primary investigator has to be focused on the evidence at hand, and they can't be, swayed by something, that the family has said. They have to look at what the evidence tells them.
So you just walked us through the critical hours, from the scene, making sure the family's safe, and friends and anyone in the community, not just the family, but anyone in the surrounding community, making sure they're safe. Can you walk us through what happens after these critical hours?
So after, I would say, the first day or two of the investigation, we start to get an idea of what happened. And at that point, there's more, I guess, direct people that we need to speak to. So from those first initial days where it's the safety and the security, and we're making sure we gather all the evidence that we can from the scene, then we start to talk to a whole bunch of people. So there's going to be interview after interview from different person, then someone else will say someone's name, and then you go speak to somebody else. And that part of the investigation can take weeks. But then there's also a point where if all of a sudden somebody was identified right away, and a suspect was arrested right away, and they've now been put in custody, then a lot of the focus of the investigative team will be dealing with that person in custody. So we may still have investigators out on the road investigating witnesses and family and things like that, but then we have probably a good significant half part of the major crimes team dealing with the suspect in custody. So you're trying to make sure that all of their legal rights are adhered to, and making sure that they are processed for any kind of evidence, and then also trying to interview them about what happened. So after that's done, and once that person is, arrested, and that the Crown has has approved charges, then that's when court can start. And so that may start the day of the homicide. You may have someone in custody, and you may have an interview, and then you have to actually get them before a justice and say, okay, we need to hold this person because they just committed a homicide. So that person may be going to a hearing right at the detachment where they're held in custody, and then given an actual court date where they appear in a courthouse in front of a judge or a justice. And then at that point, then it kind of kicks into the court process. But a lot of the investigative stuff is still happening at that time. It may be very different if it's a missing person investigation or a historical homicide where you don't have the evidence to charge the suspect at that point. So these investigations in the long run can go from 2 days to years, decades sometimes. So each investigation is very different depending on the circumstances. But those initial first few days roll out pretty much the same. I would say definitely different when there's a homicide victim to a missing person. There's differences there. But those first initial week, 2 weeks of, talking to all the witnesses, processing the scenes, getting as much evidence as possible, that pretty much happens the same for each homicide investigation. And then what's learned in that first week or two, then it kind of depends on how the investigation moves and what kind of evidence is still being sought.
How do you find families being helpful during that stage of where things just kind of seem, for some, it feels stagnant, or it feels like things aren't moving as fast? How would you categorize like good support from families, from friends, from the community, for you guys during the investigation?
Well, in an ideal situation, everybody that talks to the police will tell us the honest truth. That they'll explain to us what they know. They won't elaborate, they won't exaggerate. They will just say, this is what I heard and this is what I saw. Lots of times that doesn't happen. Lots of times there's people who are too afraid, so they won't tell you anything. Or there's people that, you don't know where their loyalties lie, so you try and get as much information from them. So my advice to any family member that's going through this is just set aside all of your worry and fear and just be as open and honest as you can be, because what we need is the honest truth, the honest story. And if you don't know anything, you don't know anything. You can only explain what you've seen, what you heard. And sadly, sometimes families aren't close and they don't know what their loved one was doing. So then all I can say is, well, I heard through this person that this is what was happening. So that's really the best and only advice I can give, is just to be as open and honest and explain what you know, and not try to hide anything. I don't want families to think that the police judge them. This is the worst day of their lives. Things happen to, terrible things happen to people, good people. And we just need to put forward the evidence, and we just need to show that the story that we're putting forward to the justice is really what happened.
Man, I find that so insightful, that the two things that really get in the way to support is fear and worry.
Fear and worry and pride. Yeah, I feel like sometimes people feel like, well, I'm this person in this upstanding family in this community, and now this happened. So they feel a bit ashamed or embarrassed, but they shouldn't. They didn't do this. There was somebody who did this to their loved one. And the best thing that they can do is just to be open and honest, because if they try and hide or minimize something that's going on, then that makes them kind of look like they're hiding and minimizing something. Like you want to make sure that they look credible, especially if you're a witness to a crime. You want them to tell the honest truth, because the last thing you want is for them to get up on the stand and tell their story and then they're found non-credible. So you want them to be as truthful and to say, this is what I saw and this is what I heard. So I think that's one of the things that I would give advice for family, is to, when you are going through this long court process and this long haul and people are talking and you know who the witnesses are and people who are actually going to get up on the stand and give testimony, support those people. But don't try to get them to rehash the story. So let's say you had two cousins witness a third cousin's murder. One was in the bedroom, one was in the kitchen. And if you start talking to them in a group, and one's information that they know and they provided to the police starts to meld into what the cousin in the kitchen knew, then all of a sudden their stories get amalgamated, and then you don't really know who actually saw what and who heard what. So the best thing is for family members is support them and say, you'll do the best you can. You don't need to talk about all the intimate details and tell me everything, because sometimes that's really hard for a witness to tell somebody's loved one, well, this is what happened at the time. So the only thing that you can do is just be supportive of them, but not to meddle with what they need to say.
Man, that's a great insight, and I think that is very helpful for us going through this time, because, as you know, as family, friends, and part of the community, we want to support as much as possible. But the big things that get in the way is pride, fear, and worry. Very insightful. Thank you for that. what should families know about historical cases, unsolved investigations, and the long wait for a resolution?
So when I moved to Alberta, because I was a major crime investigator, and I worked on some historical cases in Saskatchewan, but now this is my primary role here in Edmonton, I would say the relationship between the family and liaison with the investigative team to the family, I think what I would hope to get across is that has to be a strong relationship. If there's times where families have questions, they need to reach out to the family liaison, ask where the investigation is at. Historical cases are never closed. Lots of times there might be a lull in information coming in, but they're continuously being worked. Right now, that is the sole purpose of my unit. We only have one unit in the RCMP in Alberta, but every province will have investigators that are dedicated to historical homicides. They're never concluded. They're always looked, revamped. Many of the cases that we're working right now are actually having, it's kind of an exciting time for historical investigators because there's new ways in processing DNA. So we are getting some traction on these new cases without speaking to witnesses, without just resubmitting evidence. So there's lots of times things going on in the background, and lots of times the investigators will reach out to the family, say, hey, we're working on this, just to let you know we have some traction here. They're not going to get into the specifics, but they just want to let them know, there is something that we're working on. There's sometimes family members have said, like, I know my case is difficult. There's been years of nothing that have come forward. There's been some families that have asked to just not be contacted anymore, that they've moved on, that, yeah, they'd like to know if there's any kind of resolution in the case, but they only want to be contacted if there's that resolution. They don't want to have a 3-month callback. They don't want to have a call on, the anniversary of the death. They don't want to have a call on the victim's birthday. Things like that. Whereas other families are like, no, the day that my family member was killed, call me, because I know that's a bad day. It's going to be a bad day no matter what. So call me that day, even if it's no update, just to touch in, just so that we can talk and maintain that relationship. Because I do feel like those families that we have a good relationship between, like the family liaisons and the family members, I think those are what kind of drives the investigators to continuously working on those historical cases. So I do really think that if you are a family member and you are the assigned family liaison, not the investigator, but the family member that reaches out, that they too are a strong person. And that they're a strong person. Yes, they're dealing with the police and asking questions, but also they're the ones that are relating back to the rest of the family of what's going on. So lots of times we'll get a call by like a third uncle or like some very distant relative about what's going on with their person's case. And we may say, yes, this case is still continuing, but if you'd like any kind of more recent updates, it's best you reach out to the family member that gets those frequent updates. We always ask that in those beginning kind of initial stages of the investigation, that there is somebody who is good at relaying information, is the family liaison. So if a loved one has been killed, somebody who's really, really, really emotional might not be the right family member to be the family contact. Somebody who is actually really good at relaying information, taking it from the police, but then relaying it to the rest of the family. Like, that's the person, because there's nothing harder, I think, for a family member is if one person calls the police, they get one story, and then another person calls somebody else and they seem to get a different story, because that should never happen. Like, the story should be the same. It should always be the family liaison contacting the family contact. And granted, sometimes there has to be 2 family contacts, because sometimes families are estranged from each other and they're not going to contact each other. So sometimes we'll have 2 family contacts, but we prefer always just to reach out and get those updates to the one person that we know that will spread the news to the other family members.
So having this family liaison and this point of contact for both, the RCMP and the family members, the community, the family, is a really pivotal relationship.
And that's difficult too if that relationship breaks down, because then there can be things and people that get in, and that, or I guess if the family contact isn't told, that this cousin was reached out by the suspect, or, things like that. So there's a lot of things that family contact has to be open that can relay information back and forth to the investigative team, because there are times where the suspect or the suspect's family will reach out, sometimes just to apologize, just to say sorry, things like that. But those are things that the investigators need to know.
Very pivotal.
And that's somebody in the family that the family is comfortable calling themselves to. I do think one thing that I probably forgot, kind of moving on to the earlier part, when the family liaison person is established with the family, the initial investigation is done, everyone is safe, the scene is secure, and the investigation is moving, and it may have even moved into court. There might be a conversation that the family liaison brings up with the primary family contact, and kind of explain that it would be a good thing for the family to look at their own media strategy. I think a lot of times with the way the world is going is that so many court cases, so many homicides get sensationalized, and it's put out in the media, and it's hurtful sometimes, not meaning to be hurtful, but because of these intimate details are being put out about your loved one. So I think that would be something that I would try and address with families, just to say this is something where you want to look at, to have some idea what you want to do. And that media strategy may change over the years, because historical cases continue on, and now with the age of podcasts and things like that, there's many families are reached out to, and so they should really have a discussion with the family to say, okay, how are we going to deal with the media reaching out? How are we going to deal with social media? How are we going to deal with things that you wouldn't necessarily think of? You're going to deal with your loved one's effects, and you're going to deal with where they were living and their property and things, but you also want to look at how closed or how open you want to be in those types of situations. So that's just one process you may want to discuss and get some advice, maybe from your family liaison or with other families from the VOH and what they did at that time. Because there's some families that are like, I do not want to talk to the media at all. I want to come in the back door of the courthouse. I want to go out the back door. I don't want my face on TV at all. And then there's others that are like, no, I want to show and I want to explain this. So I think that's just one thing that I kind of failed to miss. That was one thing that I was hoping would be helpful, because that's something I think sometimes gets lost, and that sometimes people get in to a family that way. Especially through social media.
Yeah,
social media can be hurtful.
There's no really good way of communicating online. It's this type of communication that we live in that is constantly evolving and can be taken out of context. It can be it's usually not a great way to communicate to someone. The online is not. It takes away the body communication, like body languages and eye contact, and you have no control of where it goes, where it ends up. As soon as it's on the internet, it's available everywhere. So other than social media and navigating the online space, what are some other topics that families, communities, or friends might find challenging to take on?
Well, the biggest difficulty between the police and the families are that the police know all the information and the families know very little about the story. So there's a lot of things that we are keeping, the investigative team will keep quiet or keep held, and the families might hear something about, we can't tell you that because we can't jeopardize the integrity of the investigation. And I'm sure that infuriates family members because they just want to know what happened. So there's a lot of things information that won't be passed on because we need that to come out fluidly in court. There's some certain things like holdback evidence. So that will never be told. And a lot of that, when you talk about holdback evidence, that's something in the investigation that only specific investigators know. There might be only a handful, like 5 or 6 police officers that know that information. So there might be something specific at the scene that the suspect or the accused person has used or has done that only that person, that suspect or accused, will know about. So there may be something, and for example, it might be what was used to do the homicide, like a caliber of a firearm or something like that. So there's evidence that we hold, and we'll sign a form, and those few investigators keep that information. They don't discuss it in briefings. They don't discuss it with anybody, because we may not have enough evidence to charge somebody, but when we interview them and they say, well, I did this, or I used this, or I hid this, then you know it was that person. Because in this, sensationalized world, sometimes people admit to crimes that they didn't commit. And then you interview them and they tell you the story and it doesn't match at all. So there's certain things like holdback evidence that we keep very near and dear, because then we know that is like only the bad guy knows that, or only the suspect or the accused knows that information. Another topic that is always difficult with families is the autopsy reports. So because the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in this province is very busy, there is a big delay in having the finalized report. So we will have a crime scene investigator that will go to the autopsy. So they will be there as your loved one is being examined, and they will take down information that's learned from the autopsy. So it's not like the police don't know what happened. They're there. They see the evidence that's being collected by the medical examiner's office. It just takes a long time for that to get back to the police. And sometimes those autopsy reports will contain holdback information. They will contain information that is vital to the case. So we request the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner to release that report, because it contains information for the investigation. So family members may need to prove their death of a loved one. They might need to be asked by an insurance company, we need the autopsy, or we need something, autopsy report or something, to have all of these things finalized. Sometimes that's held for years. In a historical homicide case, an autopsy report might be held on file for decades. So then the family members are like, well, we can't do this or we can't do that. But I've worked with families where a letter from the police explaining why we've not released the autopsy report, then they can still, finalize their family member's estate and things like that.
So the media holdbacks and autopsies are some challenging topics that a family, friend, or a community might have a hard time working with during the process.
For sure. And that's why I'd always hope that liaison, that relationship between the family liaison investigator or victim services person and that family contact is really strong, so that they can ask those questions and they can take in the explanation of why why the autopsy report is not being released, or why they don't know the whole story, because there is holdback evidence that is critical to the case, or that they might be reached out by the media. The family may be asked to release a statement by the media to generate some information. The family may be asked, they're never told not to reach out to the media. That is completely their decision. But they may be asked to just let us know if you are saying something, or if you have been approached by the media, because there might be some really inopportune times for a media release to go out, because maybe you have a planned arrest for the next week. And if they're talking about something in the media, it may drive the suspect into hiding or something, something like that. So it's always best to have this really good open relationship between the family liaison and the family contact.
That's very helpful, I think.
Is there anything you would like to add? Anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to talk about? Or
I think the only thing it would be is that if there's any burning questions that any family member has, take it to that family contact and try and get in touch with the family liaison, even if it's one of those where, you know, we have a number of questions and it's really a text or a phone call, and just say, when you have time, you know, call us back. You know, so if you can set up a good time where you can meet, because so many times it's like a quick phone call and you don't actually get the connection. You just get the question out and then they're like, oh, I have to go because I have this appointment or this or that. So it's always best to really schedule those phone calls and schedule those, those times where those updates are, because the last thing I want to do as a family liaison is phone you in the middle of some, important day in your life where you have a business meeting or you have this, and you take the information because it's information about your loved one, but then you don't actually get all the questions you need. So it's always best to really take the time to schedule those meetings, even if it's a phone call, but schedule it for like a half an hour or an hour where you can actually talk and connect. And even if it's just you telling us about your loved one, because then we can put that into the investigation, because we always want to portray to the justice who this person was before they were murdered, so, and that's best coming from the family. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Farrah. I think this was very insightful. I think the beautiful part about having you be a part of this series was your heart of going to VOH. I think that's what stood out, especially for my wife and myself, was, Farrah keeps coming, and her heart of wanting to serve, even in the people who are at their lowest, really says a lot. Farrah, thank you so much for all your time today and for all the time you spent with us at VOH.